Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sleepy Shadows. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and fall asleep. If today was long or heavy, I'll do my best to make your night a little more comfortable with these stories. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy calm, quiet horror stories like these, you're welcome to subscribe. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. For a long time, I struggled to understand what exactly felt so wrong about my relationship with my ex. Even after we broke up, the discomfort stayed with me. It wasn't just heartbreak or bitterness. It was something deeper, something that sat heavy in my chest long after she was gone from my life. Only with time and distance have I been able to put words to it. From very early on, she talked openly about her childhood. She shared stories that were disturbing, but she told them in a way that was oddly casual, almost rehearsed. One thing she mentioned more than once was what she described as her sexual awakening. According to her, it involved playing with her sister when her sister was about 6 years old, and she herself was somewhere between 9 and 11. She didn't describe this with confusion or regret. She didn't talk about it as something that scared or troubled her. She spoke about it like it was simply a strange but important moment in her life. Something that explained who she was now. Every time she brought it up, I felt deeply uncomfortable, even though I didn't fully understand why at the time. Looking back, that discomfort was my instincts trying to warn me. She often tied this story into a larger narrative about how terrible her childhood had been. She described her family as cruel, neglectful, and deeply dysfunctional. From what I personally saw while staying at her place during my teenage years, that part was true. Her home environment was chaotic and emotionally unsafe. There was constant tension, poor boundaries, and a sense that no one was really being protected or cared for. Whatever she experienced growing up clearly left deep damage. But she didn't just share these stories to be understood. She used them. She would tell me that because of her past, she couldn't feel love without sex. That physical intimacy was the only way she felt safe, connected, or valued. If I hesitated or tried to set boundaries, she framed it as rejection. She implied that I was denying her something essential, something she needed to survive emotionally. The pressure was subtle sometimes, and other times it was overwhelming. At the same time, she was a pathological liar. Her stories shifted constantly. Details changed. Timelines didn't make sense. Something she claimed had destroyed her one day would be brushed off or contradicted later. I never knew when she was telling the truth, and when she was saying whatever would get her what she wanted in that moment. That uncertainty eroded my confidence in my own judgment. I found myself questioning my reactions, my boundaries, even my memory. What makes it worse is that this behavior didn't stop as she got older. Even now, in her 30s, she continues to surround herself with people who are young and vulnerable. Teens, people in their early 20s, people struggling with mental health issues, unstable housing, trauma, or loneliness. She seems to seek out those who are already hurting, then positions herself as someone who understands them, someone safe. Slowly, the expectations creep in. Favors, money, emotional labor, attention, control. It's rarely direct. It's wrapped in stories of hardship and need. If someone pulls away, they're made to feel guilty, uncaring, or cruel. She knows exactly how to frame herself as the victim, while quietly extracting whatever she wants from the people around her. What haunts me is how many people don't see it. She has friends, a lot of them. People who defend her, excuse her behavior, or dismiss concerns as misunderstandings. To me, her manipulation was never subtle. It felt blunt, invasive, and emotionally aggressive. But when someone is good at playing the wounded role, others often mistake harm for vulnerability. For a long time, I couldn't fully separate my anger from my gratitude. She was, in a twisted way, a lifeline for me at the time. Being connected to her helped me escape my own bad situation. I needed out, and she was an exit. When you're desperate, you sometimes accept help without questioning the cost. You convince yourself that the damage is worth it because the alternative feels worse. Eventually, I realized that staying was slowly destroying me. Going no contact was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It took years to build the emotional strength to walk away completely. Even after cutting ties, it took time for the fog to lift. Once it did, the clarity was painful. I started seeing the patterns clearly. How often guilt had been used as leverage. How frequently my boundaries had been reframed as cruelty. How easily my empathy had been exploited. How normalized the manipulation had become. What chills me now isn't just what she did to me. It's the knowledge that she's still doing it to others. I don't know if she'll ever face real consequences. I don't know if justice will catch up with her, or if she'll continue leaving damage behind her without accountability. I've stopped trying to predict or control that outcome. The only thing I can do is protect myself. Distance has given me something I didn't have before. Trust in my own instincts. I no longer second-guess myself when something feels wrong. I no longer confuse someone's trauma with permission to hurt others. I no longer feel responsible for fixing people who refuse to change. She was a necessary evil in a chapter of my life that I survived, not one I want to revisit. That chapter is closed. The cost was high, but the lesson was clear. Some people don't heal from their past. Some people weaponize it. Recognizing the difference saved me. A friend of mine told me this story years ago, and even now, long after hearing it for the first time, it still makes my skin crawl in a way I can't fully explain. It isn't dramatic in the way people expect scary stories to be. There are no screams, no blood, no sudden violence. Nothing explodes into chaos. Instead, it's quiet, subtle. The kind of story that feels unsettling not because of what happened, but because of how normal everything seemed before and after. That's what makes it stick. He was still young at the time, not a little kid, but not quite old enough to fully trust his instincts either. He went with his mom to stay at his grandmother's house for a short visit. The grandmother lived alone, and the house had been in the family for a long time. Generations, from what he understood. It was the kind of place people often describe as having history, but at the time, he didn't attach much meaning to that phrase. The house wasn't abandoned or decaying. It wasn't falling apart or visibly creepy, but it had weight to it. The walls were thick and held in sound. The ceilings felt a little lower than modern houses. The hallways were narrow and long, and the floors creaked no matter how carefully you tried to walk. It smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and something else he couldn't identify. Not bad, just old. His mom didn't want to go alone. She never gave him a clear reason, just said the house made her uncomfortable. Not scared exactly, just uneasy. Like something about being there by herself didn't sit right with her, especially at night. She said she didn't sleep well there anymore, worried that she always felt like she was listening for something. At the time, he didn't think much of it. Adults sometimes said things like that about old places. He figured it was just nerves, or memories, or imagination. Old houses made strange noises. That didn't mean anything was actually wrong. So he went with her. That first evening passed without incident. They ate dinner, talked, watched some television. The house seemed quiet, even peaceful. When it came time to sleep, there weren't enough bedrooms properly set up, so he took the couch in the living room. The couch faced directly toward a dark hallway that led to the bedrooms and the bathroom. Even with the lights off, the hallway felt long. The shadows seemed deeper there than in the rest of the house. His mom went into her room, said goodnight, and shut the door. Eventually, the house settled into silence. At some point during the night, he woke up. He didn't jolt awake or sit straight up. It was the kind of waking that feels gradual, like drifting back to the surface after sinking into deep water. At first, he wasn't sure why he was awake at all. There was no loud noise, no sudden bang or crash, no obvious disturbance, just the feeling that something had changed. Then he heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from somewhere down the hallway. Slow and steady. Not rushed, not heavy. Just the soft, deliberate sound of someone walking across old floorboards. His first thought wasn't fear. It was his mom. He assumed she'd gotten up to use the bathroom. The house was unfamiliar, and the floor creaked. That was normal. He didn't want to deal with small talk or questions, so he closed his eyes and stayed still. If she thought he was asleep, she wouldn't stop. The footsteps continued. They didn't pause or turn away. They moved closer, step by step, down the hallway, into the living room. Closer, closer, until they were right near the couch. His body tensed without him consciously deciding to move. His eyes stayed shut. His breathing slowed. He focused on staying perfectly still, the way people do when they're pretending to sleep, but are suddenly very aware of their surroundings. Then he felt it. Breath. Warm air brushed across his forehead. It wasn't imagined. It wasn't vague. It was clear and unmistakable. Someone was standing directly over him, leaning close enough that he could feel their breath on his skin. The sensation was intimate, in a way that made his stomach tighten. It felt exactly like the moment just before a parent gives a child a goodnight kiss. That brief pause. That quiet closeness. For a second, he felt comforted. Safe. He assumed his mom had come out to check on him. Then the moment ended. The warmth moved away. He felt the presence straighten up. The footsteps returned, moving back across the living room, back down the hallway, and then fading into silence. He didn't move. He didn't open his eyes. He stayed frozen on that couch, his heart beating hard in his chest, his thoughts racing but not quite forming words. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him back into sleep. Morning came. Sunlight filled the house through the windows. Everything looked different in the daylight. The hallway didn't feel so long. The shadows didn't feel so deep. The air felt lighter, almost ordinary. At breakfast, casually, he asked his mom why she'd come out to check on him during the night. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him with confusion. She told him she hadn't left her room. She said she'd woken up during the night with a deep feeling of unease. A sense that something wasn't right. She didn't hear footsteps. She didn't see anything. But she felt scared enough that she stayed in her room, wide awake, not even getting up to use the bathroom. When he told her what he'd experienced, neither of them laughed. They didn't brush it off. They didn't argue. They just sat there quietly, both unsettled in their own way. What stayed with him wasn't the footsteps. It wasn't even the breath on his skin. It was how calm it had felt, how familiar, how gentle, and the thought that if he had opened his eyes, well, he might have seen something that looked like his mother. A few months later, his grandmother passed away. They returned to the house to sort through her belongings. During the day, it felt sad but normal. Just an old house filled with memories, dust, and quiet rooms. But when night came, the feeling returned. The heaviness, the silence, the sense that the house didn't want anyone there anymore. That night, without discussion, they left and stayed at a motel. They never spent another night in that house. Even now, years later, my friend says the worst part is not knowing what would have happened if he'd opened his eyes. Sometimes the scariest things aren't loud. Sometimes they're gentle. And sometimes you're grateful you didn't look. There are places we live in that never really leave us, even after we move away. Not because they were special or beautiful, but because something happened there that changed how we see the world. For me, the place I used to live is tied to two events that I still think about years later. They weren't connected to each other, but they happened close enough in time and space that they blended into a single feeling. A realization that terrible things can happen quietly, right next to you, without warning. The first incident happened in the very apartment building where I lived. It was the kind of building where you recognized faces but didn't really know people. You might nod to someone in the hallway, hear voices through walls, or recognize footsteps on the stairs, but everyone mostly kept to themselves. We all lived close together, but in our own separate bubbles. One night, very late, sometime around 2 a.m, a loud argument broke out in one of the apartments. I didn't hear it myself, which I'm grateful for, but others did. From what I was told later, the fighting was intense. Screaming, doors slamming. The kind of argument that makes people freeze in their beds, wondering if they should intervene or call someone, but not knowing what to do. The man who lived there was a police officer. That detail matters, not because it explains what happened, but because it makes it harder to process. He was someone trained to handle crisis, someone entrusted with protecting others. On that night, none of that mattered. After the fight escalated, he stormed out of the apartment with their young son. The boy was very small, maybe 3 or 4 years old. We were still at the age where being woken up in the middle of the night and dragged out of the house would be confusing and frightening. The man drove the child to his brother's place. The uncle was confused but didn't question it too much. He knew there was fighting. He assumed emotions were running high and that things would calm down by morning. He took the child in, thinking he was helping keep him safe. Then the man went back. Back to the apartment. Back to the argument. Back to whatever thoughts were spiraling in his head. At some point after that, he shot his wife. Then he shot himself. The sounds of the gunshots were heard by neighbors. People who lived closest were exposed to something that will never leave them. The kind of sound that rewires your nervous system forever. The kind that follows you into sleep. I didn't hear the shots that night. I didn't wake up to screaming or sirens. I learned about it later, and in some ways, that made it worse. Knowing that something so violent had happened so close to me while I slept peacefully, completely unaware. The child survived because he wasn't there. That fact alone is almost unbearable to think about. One decision, made in anger or chaos, saved a child's life. Everything else was lost. The second event happened just a block away, at a friend's apartment building. That building was designed differently. The ground floor had bright white tiles that reflected light. To get anywhere, whether you were leaving the building or entering it, you had to pass through a common area. From there, you could see up at all the balconies that lined the upper floors. It was open, airy, and exposed, but there was no way to avoid seeing what happened in that space. One night, a woman who lived there ended her life. She had been suffering from severe depression. People knew she was struggling, but knowing doesn't always mean being able to stop something. She jumped from the top of the building. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. These things always do. But what stayed with me wasn't the article or the official details. It was my friend's reaction. When she talked about it, her face changed in a way I'd never seen before. Her voice dropped. She said very little, and then she said something that I will never forget. "Red," she said. There was red splattered everywhere. There was no drama in her voice, no exaggeration, just a flat statement of fact. Later, when we were hanging out at her place, she showed me the ground floor. And the tiles that were once bright white were still stained. They had been cleaned thoroughly, scrubbed, treated. Whatever could be done had been done. But some stains never fully go away. There were darker patches in strange, uneven shapes. Not obvious at first glance, but once you knew what they were, you couldn't unsee them. She looked at me and said, "Yeah, it's exactly what you're thinking it is." That building went back to normal life. People still walked through that space every day. They carried groceries over those tiles. They passed through on their way to work, on their phones, thinking about their own lives. But the stains remained. Both of these events taught me the same quiet lesson. Tragedy doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it happens behind closed doors, in the middle of the night, while others sleep. Sometimes it happens in shared spaces, in plain sight, leaving marks that cleaning crews can't fully erase. And sometimes you only realize how close you were after the fact. Those places don't feel the same afterward. Even when you move away, they stay with you. Not as constant fear, but as awareness. A reminder of how thin the line is between ordinary life and irreversible loss, and how easily it can be crossed. The Donner Party is one of those stories that never really leaves you once you learn about it. It isn't just a historical event from the 1800s. It feels more like a warning that echoes across time. A reminder of how fragile human plans are when they collide with nature, bad decisions, and desperation. In the 1840s, America was deep into the era of westward expansion. People believed California was the future. Rich land, opportunity, freedom, and a fresh start. Families packed up everything they owned, sold their homes, gathered their children, and joined wagon trains to cross thousands of miles of wilderness. They weren't reckless thrill seekers. They were ordinary people chasing hope. The Donner Party was one of those groups. They were made up of families, including men, women, children, and elderly relatives. For many of them were immigrants, especially from Europe, who believed this journey would lead to a better life. They were not poor or unprepared by the standards of the time. They had wagons, oxen, supplies, and experience traveling long distances. What went wrong was not one single mistake, but a chain of them. At some point during the journey, the group decided to take a shortcut. It was called the Hastings Cutoff. The route promised to save time and distance, but it was poorly tested and dangerously misleading. The guide who promoted it had never actually taken wagons through the entire route himself. The shortcut turned out to be anything but short. Instead of saving time, it slowed them down dramatically. The terrain was brutal. Dense forests, rough mountains, and salt flats that exhausted their animals. Wagons broke, oxen weakened, but progress crawled. By the time they realized how badly the decision had set them back, it was already too late in the year. Winter was coming. As the group pushed into the Sierra Nevada mountains, heavy snowstorms hit earlier and harder than expected. Snow piled up fast. Roads disappeared. Trails vanished. Wagons became stuck. Eventually, the Donner Party was completely trapped. They could not move forward. They could not go back. They built makeshift shelters near what is now Donner Lake, hoping the snow would ease and rescue would come. But the winter only got worse. Snow piled several feet deep. Temperatures dropped. Food supplies began to run out. At first they rationed carefully. They ate what they had brought. Then they slaughtered their livestock. Oxen, cattle, and horses were killed for meat. When that ran out, they boiled hides. But bones and leather? They chewed on bark. They scraped grease from cooking pots. Children cried from hunger. Adults weakened. People became sick. Some froze to death during the night. Hope slowly collapsed. Eventually, some members of the group tried to escape on foot, using improvised snowshoes. They hoped to reach help and bring back supplies. That journey itself became another nightmare. Many of those people died along the way, collapsing from exhaustion or freezing in the snow. As the weeks passed, death became unavoidable. People began dying from starvation, illness, and exposure. And then came the moment that history remembers most: cannibalism. It did not happen suddenly, and it was not done lightly. It happened after death had already claimed many lives. The survivors were faced with an impossible choice: die, or eat the bodies of those who had already passed away. Accounts from the time make it clear that this decision destroyed people emotionally. Parents were forced to confront things no human being should ever have to consider. Survivors described shame, grief, and horror that followed them for the rest of their lives. Some refused and died as a result. Others did what they had to do to keep going. Children survived because adults made those choices. Eventually, rescue parties reached the camps, but by then, the damage was irreversible. Of the roughly 87 people who began the journey, only about half survived. Many of the survivors were permanently scarred, physically and psychologically. Some never spoke about it again. Others were haunted by it for the rest of their lives. The Donner Party became a symbol of the darkest side of westward expansion. Not the triumph, not the opportunity, but the cost. It showed how optimism and ambition could turn deadly when mixed with bad information and nature's indifference. The story has been retold in books, documentaries, and films. One movie that references it early on is 17 Miracles. The brief imagery tied to the Donner Party is deeply unsettling. Snow, silence, hunger, desperation. Even without graphic detail, the weight of what happened is unmistakable. What makes the Donner Party so disturbing isn't just the cannibalism, even though that is what most people focus on. It's the slow collapse, the waiting, the hope that rescue might come tomorrow, the sound of wind outside snow-covered shelters, and the knowledge that children are starving and there is nothing left to give them. It's the realization that these were not villains or monsters. They were families. They were people who wanted a better life. They were parents who loved their children. They were victims of circumstance, bad choices, and an unforgiving environment. The Donner Party reminds us that history isn't always made of heroes and victories. Sometimes it's made of suffering that never should have happened. And sometimes survival itself comes at a cost so heavy that even living feels like a punishment. It remains one of the saddest and most haunting chapters in the story of westward expansion. Not because people died, but because of what they were forced to do to live. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Sleepy Shadows for daily calm horror stories made for late nights and sleep. You can also turn on notifications so you don't miss a new story when the night gets quiet and the shadows return. Now, let's continue. When I was about 13 years old, my grandparents owned a house right on the water. It was one of those places that felt like a secret world when you were a kid. The house sat on a long, narrow peninsula, surrounded on almost all sides by water and thick woods. The trees were tall and old, packed close together. and during the summer the leaves were so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. It always smelled like damp earth, moss, and lake water. Because my grandparents lived in Florida for about half the year, they treated the house like a family vacation place. All of their adult children were free to use it whenever they wanted. That meant that every now and then, my parents would take us there for weekends or longer stays. To me, it felt like absolute freedom. There were no neighbors close by, no traffic, or no noise except insects, birds, and the occasional splash of something moving through the water. The woods around the house were crisscrossed with streams. Some were shallow and easy to hop across, while others were surprisingly deep and slow-moving. Over time, water had carved out pockets along these streams, creating little swimming holes. They weren't official or marked or anything like that. They were just places kids discovered and claimed. One of these swimming holes became my favorite. I don't know the exact depth anymore. At the time, it felt enormous. I remember thinking it had to be at least 12 or 15 feet deep. The water was dark and cloudy, especially once you went more than a few feet under the surface. You couldn't see the bottom clearly at all, just vague shapes and shadows. Even as a kid, I knew it was probably not the safest place to swim, but that didn't really register in my mind as something to avoid. It just made it more exciting. What made this spot even better was the rope swing. Someone, at some point long before I ever found the place, had tied a thick rope around a sturdy tree limb that hung out over the water. The rope was rough and weathered but strong. You could grab it, run forward, swing out over the water, and let go at just the right moment. If you timed it perfectly, you'd fly out and drop straight down into the deepest part of the hole. To a kid, it felt like the coolest thing in the world. Looking back now, I realize how reckless it all was. The water was deep, the visibility was terrible, and there was no adult supervision anywhere nearby. But at 13, you don't think about those things. But you think you're invincible. You think nothing bad can happen to you. One afternoon, my parents decided to take a nap. The house was quiet, and the air was warm and still. I remember lying there, bored, listening to the distant sounds of water and insects drifting through the open windows. That's when I got the idea that it would be the perfect time to go swimming. Alone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't ask permission. I just slipped out of the house and made my way through the woods toward the swimming hole. The path wasn't well defined, but I knew it by heart. I'd walked it enough times to recognize the way the ground dipped, where the roots stuck out, where the light changed. When I reached the swimming hole, everything looked the same as always. The water was calm, the rope hanging still from the tree branch. No one else was around. It felt peaceful and inviting. That's when another idea popped into my head. I wondered if I could touch the bottom. I had never tried before. I had jumped in plenty of times, but I always let myself float back up without really pushing it. That day, I decided to see just how deep it really was. I told myself it would be quick. I'd drop down, touch the bottom, and push back up. Simple. I pulled the rope back as far as I could, stepping backward until I was on my tiptoes. My arms were stretched, the rope tight. I took a breath, ran forward as fast as I could, and felt that familiar moment of weightlessness as my feet left the ground. Then I let go. The fall felt longer than usual. The water swallowed me instantly, the cold shock hitting my skin as I sank. I didn't fight it. I let myself drop straight down, counting in my head, watching the light fade as everything turned darker and murkier. To my surprise, I actually hit the bottom. My feet touched something solid, and for a split second, I felt proud. I had done it. I reached the bottom. Without thinking too much about it, I pushed off with my legs, expecting to shoot back up toward the surface. Instead, I barely moved. I felt myself go up a few inches, and then something yanked me back down. At first, I was just confused. I tried again, kicking harder this time. Again, nothing. I went nowhere. That's when panic began to creep in. I looked down and tried to figure out what was happening, but the water was too cloudy. All I could see were vague shapes. In my mind, I realized that my swimming trunks must have gotten caught on something, probably a submerged stump or a log. But fear doesn't listen to logic, especially when you're underwater and running out of air. In my panicked brain, it felt like something had grabbed me. I started struggling. I twisted my body, kicked, pulled at my shorts, anything I could think of. Each movement burned energy I didn't have. My lungs started screaming for air. The pressure in my chest became unbearable. Then my vision started to change. The edges of my sight began to darken, like someone slowly closing curtains around the world. Bright spots flashed in front of my eyes, little bursts of light that made it hard to focus. My lungs felt like they were on fire, like they were collapsing inward. Every instinct in my body was telling me to breathe, but I couldn't. I could feel myself starting to lose control. My limbs felt heavy, sluggish. My thoughts slowed down. What the fight was draining out of me, replaced by a terrifying sense of fading away. I remember thinking very clearly that I was about to die. And then something happened. Through the murky water, I saw movement. A shape appeared near me. At first, I thought my brain was just making things up, like flashes in a dream. But the shape came closer, more defined. Hands reached for me. Those hands grabbed my shorts and pulled hard. I felt fabric tear. Suddenly, the pressure holding me down was gone. Someone grabbed me, wrapped an arm around me, and pushed upward. We shot toward the surface. The next thing I remember is bursting out of the water and sucking in air so hard it hurt. I coughed and gasped, barely able to keep myself afloat. When I looked around, I was alone. There was no one there. No adult, no other swimmer. No sign of anyone who could have saved me. The rope was still hanging motionless. The woods were silent. The water rippled gently, as if nothing had happened at all. The only physical proof of what I'd been through was a large tear in one leg of my bathing suit. I swam to the edge as fast as I could and dragged myself out, collapsing onto the muddy bank. I lay there for a long time, shaking, trying to catch my breath and understand what had just happened. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Eventually, I made my way back to the house. I didn't tell my parents what had happened. I didn't know how. I wasn't even sure what I believed myself. Over the years, I've thought about that moment countless times. I've gone back and forth about what really happened down there. And part of me is convinced that the figure I saw was nothing more than my oxygen-starved brain creating something to save itself. A hallucination. A last, desperate effort of survival. I think that somehow, in that final moment, my body found the strength to tear free. That the same instinct forced me upward, whether through swimming or buoyancy or sheer luck. The human mind is powerful, especially when it believes it's about to die. But even knowing all that, there's still a part of me that can't fully explain how real it felt. How clear the sensation of being grabbed was. How distinct that presence seemed. That swimming hole sat above my head for years, waiting quietly while I slept in my grandparents' house. And every time I think about it, I remember just how close I came to never leaving it at all. I still think about this story whenever people talk about college being the best years of your life. For most people, college is stressful but hopeful. It's supposed to be a time of independence, growth, and figuring out who you are. That's why what happened makes it so disturbing. It didn't happen in some dark, isolated place. It happened in a dorm room, in a place meant to be full of life. This happened when I was in school at UMass Amherst. We were freshmen, barely adults, still figuring out how to live away from home, still tied emotionally to our families, even when those relationships were strained or painful. The girl involved was someone I went to school with. I wasn't close to her, but I knew who she was. We had classes in the same buildings. We passed each other on campus. She looked like any other student. Nothing about her stood out in a way that would make you think something this dark was coming. What people later learned was that she had a very difficult relationship with her mother. I don't know all the details, and honestly, I don't think anyone fully did except the two of them. But it was clear there was deep resentment there. Anger, pain, things that had been building for years. At some point during her freshman year, she contacted her mother and invited her to campus. She asked her to come to her dorm so they could go out to lunch together. To her mother, this meant something hopeful. Parents want to believe things can be fixed, that distance and time might soften old wounds, that maybe college had given her daughter space, perspective, or maturity. Her mother came to campus believing this was a chance to reconnect, to reset their relationship, even just a little. She arrived at the dorm building and went to her daughter's room. On the door, there was a note. It said something along the lines of, "Mom, come in. I am in the closet." There was nothing immediately alarming about it. Dorm rooms are small. Closets are sometimes used for privacy. It didn't scream danger. It didn't suggest urgency. It just seemed odd. The mother opened the door. She stepped inside the room. She went to the closet. And there, she found her daughter. Her daughter had taken her own life. She had arranged things so that her mother would be the one to find her. Not a roommate, not a resident advisor, not campus police. Her mother. That part is what people have never been able to wrap their heads around. This wasn't just suicide. It was deliberate in a way that feels targeted. And it was final. And it was meant to deliver pain. The act itself wasn't impulsive. It was planned. The invitation, the note, the timing, all of it was intentional. When the news spread across campus, the reaction was immediate and heavy. Dorms went quiet in a way they never usually do. People whispered, rumors flew, but the core facts were horrifying enough on their own. Students were shaken not just by the death, but by where and how it happened. A dorm room is supposed to be safe, familiar, temporary. The idea that something so final could happen there made everyone feel exposed. Counselors were brought in, meetings were held, emails were sent out about grief resources and mental health services. Professors acknowledged it in class. Some students cried openly, others went numb. But the most haunting part wasn't the campus response. It was imagining the mother, a woman who drove to see her daughter, who walked into a dorm expecting lunch, who believed, even for a moment, that something might be healing between them. Instead, she was confronted with the worst possible reality. People often talk about suicide in terms of escape, pain, or illness, and those things are real. But in this case, there was also something darker layered on top of it, a desire to hurt, to leave a scar that could never heal. That's what makes this story linger in people's minds. Not just that a young woman died, but that she chose to make her mother the one who would live with that image forever. There's no neat explanation for something like that. Mental illness, trauma, resentment, and untreated pain can twist a person's thinking in ways that don't make sense to anyone outside their head. Yet what feels like closure or justice to someone in deep distress can actually be devastating cruelty to the people left behind. After it happened, people speculated endlessly. Was she trying to punish her mother? Was she trying to communicate something she felt she was never heard about? Was she trying to force her mother to finally see her pain? No one knows, and no one ever will. What remains is the aftermath. A campus that moved on, slowly, a dorm room that was cleaned out. A name that faded from daily conversation, but never fully disappeared from memory. And a mother who will carry that moment with her for the rest of her life. Stories like this are uncomfortable because they don't fit into easy narratives. There's no clear villain, no simple lesson. They're just the reality that pain passed down through relationships can explode in ways that hurt far beyond the person who is suffering. It's a reminder that hatred, when left to rot without intervention, doesn't just destroy one person. It spreads, it scars, it leaves damage that can't be undone. And for those of us who were there, who shared the same campus, the same hallways, the same sense of being young and overwhelmed, it left a quiet but permanent mark. Because it showed us, far too early, that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us the most. And sometimes, the final act of that pain is something no one can ever recover from. It is one of those experiences that stays with you because of how raw, confusing, and deeply human it was. I've worked as a 911 operator for a long time, and most people have no idea how many strange, heartbreaking, and frightening calls come through every single day. You build a kind of emotional armor to do the job. You have to. But every once in a while, a call breaks through that armor and stays with you no matter how much time passes. This was one of those calls. It was years ago, back when our systems were not nearly as advanced as they are now. Location data was unreliable. Mapping tools were clunky. Caller information wasn't always available instantly. Sometimes all you had was a voice, panic on the line, and the responsibility to somehow turn chaos into help. The call came in without warning, like most of them do. There was no build-up, no context, just a man's voice on the other end of the line. He sounded terrified in a way that immediately set off alarms in my head. Not angry, not hysterical in the usual way. This was raw fear, stripped down and unfiltered. He said very clearly, "I found a decapitated body. There's blood everywhere. Please help me." Those words hit hard, even for someone used to hearing awful things. There was no embellishment in his voice, no dramatic pauses. He wasn't trying to scare anyone. He sounded like someone whose brain was overloaded and desperately trying to survive the moment. I did what I always do. I slowed my voice. I asked him to take a breath. I asked him where he was. He didn't know. That happens sometimes, but usually people at least have a general idea. A street name, a landmark, a town. This man had nothing. He couldn't tell me where he was, how he got there, or even how long he'd been there. His answers were fragmented, disconnected. Every time I tried to ground him with basic questions, he spiraled back into describing the scene he thought he was seeing. Blood everywhere, a body, no head. He kept apologizing, as if he thought he was doing something wrong by calling. He sounded ashamed and scared at the same time. Our system couldn't pull up his phone number. It wasn't registered in our local database. That made things worse. No automatic location ping, no address tied to the line, just a voice in crisis. I tried shifting strategies. I asked about his surroundings. What could he see? What did the building look like? Were there stores? Windows? Lights? Slowly, piece by piece, something started to form. He mentioned wide hallways, on empty storefronts, echoes, a big open space, broken glass in some places, silence except for his own breathing. That's when it clicked. An abandoned mall. Once we had that, we started cross-referencing. There were a few in the general region, long closed and left to rot. Places people wandered into for shelter, curiosity, or because they had nowhere else to go. I dispatched officers immediately, giving them everything I had, which still felt like far too little. While units were en route, I stayed on the line with him. That's part of the job people don't see. You don't just send help and hang up. You stay, you anchor, you try to keep someone from falling apart completely. He was deteriorating as the minutes passed. His fear kept cycling. He would calm for a few seconds, then suddenly gasp and say the blood was spreading, or that he could hear something, or that the body was looking at him. I knew then, deep down, that something wasn't adding up in the way a real crime scene usually does. The details were shifting too much. The horror was too internal. But you don't dismiss someone in that state. Whether it's real or not doesn't matter in the moment. Their fear is real. I kept him talking. I asked him to sit down. I asked him to drink water if he had any. He said he didn't think he'd had anything to drink in a long time. His voice was dry. His words slurred slightly. He was exhausted. Eventually, one of the officers radioed in. There was no body, no blood, no signs of violence at all. Instead, they found a man curled up inside the abandoned mall, dehydrated, confused, and shaking. One of the officers recognized him almost immediately. But he had been reported missing in a nearby jurisdiction days earlier. That's when the full picture came together. The man had schizophrenia. He had stopped taking his medication. How or why, I don't know. Sometimes people run out. Sometimes they don't like the side effects. Sometimes life just collapses around them and routines disappear. Whatever the reason, his illness had taken full control. The scene he described with such certainty existed entirely in his mind. To him, it was real. Every detail, every drop of blood, every ounce of terror. When the officers approached him, they did it carefully, gently. They didn't challenge what he was experiencing. They focused on getting him safe. He was transported to a hospital immediately. He stayed inpatient for several days. They treated his dehydration. They stabilized him. They restarted his medication regimen. He was reunited with his family. The last update I heard was that he was doing much better. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. What stays with me is not relief. It's perspective. People talk about schizophrenia like it's just seeing things or hearing voices, as if that somehow makes it less serious. What they don't understand is that to the person experiencing it, those things are as real as anything you or I see in front of us. The fear doesn't come with a disclaimer. The terror doesn't soften just because it's happening inside the brain. That man believed, with everything he had, that he had stumbled upon something unimaginably horrific. His brain gave him no escape, no pause button, no way to reality check in the moment. And he was alone, lost, dehydrated, terrified, calling a stranger as his last lifeline. That's what haunts me. Not the imagined body, not the blood, but the vulnerability. The way a human being can be so completely overtaken by their own mind that the world becomes a waking nightmare. The way systems fail people quietly long before they end up alone in an abandoned mall, calling emergency services in absolute terror. I think about how easily that call could have gone wrong. If he hadn't called. If we hadn't pieced together enough clues. If officers hadn't recognized him. If he had wandered longer without water. Schizophrenia doesn't just hurt the people who have it. It isolates them. It confuses them. It puts them in danger in ways most people never consider. That call didn't end in violence or tragedy, and I'm grateful for that. But it left a mark. Every time someone minimizes mental illness, I think of that man, whispering in fear, apologizing for being scared, describing something that wasn't there but was completely real to him. And I remember how thin the line can be between safety and disaster when the mind turns against itself. Some calls don't haunt you because of what happened. They haunt you because of what almost did. It's strange how memory works when fear is involved. Some moments blur together over time, softened at the edges, but others stay sharp forever, frozen exactly as they happened. This is one of those moments for me. It's not a story I tell often, because every time I do, I'm right back there in my early 20s, heart racing, adrenaline flooding my body, convinced that something terrible was unfolding in real time and that I was powerless to stop it. It was fall of 2002, and we were living in Baton Rouge. Anyone who lived there during that period knows exactly what that means without further explanation. The city was on edge in a way I've never experienced before or since. Fear wasn't just something you felt at night or in quiet moments. It was everywhere. It hung in the air. It followed you to the grocery store, the gas station, and your driveway. Every woman I knew was scared, and every man I knew was worried for the women in their lives. The reason, of course, was the serial killer who was active in the area at the time. The news was relentless. The FBI was involved. Press conferences were broadcast constantly. Descriptions of the suspect and his vehicle were repeated over and over until they burned themselves into everyone's mind. People were told to be vigilant, to travel in groups, to watch for suspicious behavior. Trust evaporated almost overnight. My girlfriend at the time was as careful as anyone could reasonably be. She didn't go out late. She paid attention to her surroundings. She locked her doors. But fear doesn't ask whether you've done everything right before it shows up. That afternoon, she had gone to Walmart. It was an ordinary errand, the kind of thing you don't think twice about. I wasn't with her. I was at home with my best friend, who also happened to be my roommate. The phone rang, and when I picked up, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Her voice was shaky, tight. She was trying to stay calm, but panic kept slipping through. She told me she had just left Walmart and that a white pickup truck was following her. At first, I tried to slow the conversation down. People misread situations all the time, especially when fear is already high. But as she talked, the details piled up. She said she'd noticed the truck almost immediately after leaving the parking lot. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Baton Rouge was full of pickup trucks. That alone didn't mean anything, but then she started testing it. She turned off her normal route and drove into a cul-de-sac. The truck followed her in and turned around when she did. She drove out and took a different route, looping back through side streets. The truck stayed behind her. She took another turn, then another, deliberately erratic now, trying to confirm what she was seeing. The truck never left. By this point, she was terrified. The FBI had publicly stated that the suspect might be driving a white pickup truck. That detail alone was enough to turn an uneasy situation into a nightmare. She was crying now, trying to keep her voice steady enough to tell me where she was. I didn't hesitate. I told her to keep driving and stay on the phone with me. I hung up, grabbed my keys, and my best friend was already moving. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The urgency in my voice was enough. But we jumped into his car and tore across town. Those few minutes felt endless. Baton Rouge traffic suddenly felt like an obstacle course designed to slow us down. Every red light was agony. Every car in front of us felt like an enemy. I stayed on the phone with her as much as I could, giving her instructions, trying to keep her focused, trying to keep her from panicking completely. Then, suddenly, we saw her. We were exiting near Dalrymple, close to LSU. She came into view first, and just behind her, unmistakable, was the white pickup truck. Seeing it with my own eyes made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. This was happening. She drove right past us, and we fell in behind the truck. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Part of me wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation. LSU's campus was right there, College kids played stupid games all the time. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was someone following the wrong car. But another part of me remembered the faces of the victims on the news, remembered the press conferences, remembered the warnings. She was house-sitting for a wealthy relative nearby. So I called her again and told her we were behind the truck. I told her to head straight to the house and pull in. Moments later, she did exactly that. She turned into the driveway, and the truck slowed, then stopped one house earlier, parked along the edge of the LSU lakes. We pulled up behind her. She was hysterical when she got out of the car. Crying, shaking, barely able to stand. I held her and tried to calm her down, and telling her that it was probably nothing, that LSU was right there, that it could be some kind of prank or misunderstanding. I don't know if I believed my own words, but I needed her to hear them. My roommate stood on the porch, watching, ready to call for help if things went sideways. I took a deep breath and walked toward the truck. Every step felt heavy. My mind was racing through worst-case scenarios. What if he had a gun? What if he tried to grab me? What if I was about to make everything worse? As I got closer, I could see the driver clearly for the first time. He was an African-American man. I felt a rush of relief so intense it almost made me dizzy. The FBI had stated repeatedly that the suspect was white. In that instant, a huge part of the fear drained out of me. I told myself we were safe, that this had been a misunderstanding after all. I approached the driver's side window and explained, as calmly as I could, that he had scared my girlfriend. I told him he must have followed the wrong car leaving Walmart. I wasn't aggressive, I wasn't threatening, I just wanted the situation to end. He didn't look directly at me. He gave me a sideways glance, said nothing, then pulled away and drove off. I watched the truck disappear down the road, feeling the tension finally start to ease. We went back inside. I stayed with my girlfriend until she calmed down. We talked it through, replayed the events, and eventually convinced ourselves that it had been nothing more than a coincidence, amplified by fear. Life went on. A year later, everything changed. I was flipping through the newspaper when I saw his face on the front page. The same man, the same eyes, the same expression. Arrested after DNA evidence linked him to the murders that had terrorized Baton Rouge. His name was Derek Todd Lee. In that moment, my stomach dropped. All the rationalizations collapsed at once. The relief I'd felt that night turned into something else entirely. A sick, twisting realization that my girlfriend had been right, that she had trusted her instincts, that she had been in real danger, and that I had stood just a few feet away from a man who had already killed, who would kill again, and who had been following someone I loved. I think about how close it was sometimes, how small decisions could have changed everything. What if she hadn't called me? What if we hadn't been able to get there in time? What if he hadn't stopped when she pulled into the driveway? But what haunts me most isn't bravery or heroism. It's how ordinary it all felt in hindsight. A Walmart parking lot, a familiar road, a house near a lake. Evil didn't announce itself with anything dramatic. It followed quietly, patiently, blending in until it didn't have to anymore. That experience changed how I think about fear, about intuition, about the way people dismiss their own instincts because they don't want to seem dramatic or paranoid. My girlfriend knew something was wrong, and she acted on it. That decision may have saved her life. Sometimes, when people talk about serial killers in abstract terms, as distant monsters from documentaries and podcasts, I think back to that afternoon, to a white pickup truck, to a man who wouldn't look me in the eye, to the relief I felt that turned out to be misplaced. And I'm reminded that sometimes danger doesn't look like what you expect at all. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just fade away, they stayed with you. Each one was shared to feel real, quiet, and close. Moments that could happen to anyone. Moments where something felt wrong, or nearly did. If you'd like to keep listening to stories that linger long after they're told, consider subscribing to Sleepy Shadows. There are more waiting in the dark, and not all of them disappear by morning. Good night.